The cashier didn't panic during the bank takeover, and the ruthless Mafia boss watching from the shadows of the VIP lounge recognized her icy stare instantly. Before we continue, I'm curious, where are you watching this story from today? Drop your country or city in the comments. Now, let's go back to the moment everything inside that bank changed. Afternoon sunlight angled through the vaulted glass ceilings, casting long shadows across the polished marble. The Metropolitan Bank was bustling. A corporate executive at the teller line, a mother wrangling a toddler, 2 security guards checking IDs near the entrance. Kendra Blake was behind her station, impeccably dressed in a tailored black business suit and a crisp white shirt, sorting a stack of deposit slips when the front doors blew open and a heavily armed crew breached the lobby. Chaos erupted instantly. The executive dropped his briefcase and hit the floor. The mother dragged her child behind a marble pillar. The security guards were disarmed before they could even unholster their weapons. Kendra didn't flinch. She remained perfectly upright, her hands resting calmly on the counter, and analyzed the lead gunman with the cold, calculating gaze of a chess grandmaster watching a novice make a fatal mistake. No trembling, no gasps, no widened eyes. Just a controlled exhale and a voice so steady and authoritative it forced the screaming gunman to pause. The main vault is on a time lock, she stated clearly. You have exactly 3 minutes before tactical units secure this block. I suggest you recalculate. Up on the mezzanine, cloaked in the shadows of the VIP lounge, a man in a bespoke dark suit closed his ledger without a sound. His posture remained perfectly still. His expression didn't change, but something hot and dangerous flared behind his eyes, like a dormant predator catching a fiercely familiar scent. Seo Kang-Min hadn't reached for his weapon. He hadn't called his men. He was simply captivated. The sirens had long faded into the city's ambient noise, but the sterile scent of gun smoke still clung to Kendra's blazer. She stood in the center of her meticulously organized apartment, the sharp lines of her minimalist furniture offering a stark contrast to the chaos she had just navigated. She hadn't trembled when the police took her statement, nor had she accepted the bank manager's frantic offering of a week's paid trauma leave. Instead, she had simply locked her terminal, adjusted her cuffs, and walked out into the biting evening air. Survival was not about processing fear, it was about compartmentalizing it. But by midnight, the illusion of control began to fracture. The footage did not make the local news. The bank's executives had immediately enforced a total media blackout to protect their stock prices. Instead, the raw security feed bypassed the press entirely and bled straight into the encrypted, volatile channels of the city's criminal underworld. It was an absolute digital humiliation. The cartel-backed crew had expected to be feared as untouchable phantoms. Instead, they had been publicly outmaneuvered, stared down, and given a tactical countdown by a cashier in a crisp white shirt. Kendra sat perfectly still at her kitchen island, staring at the encrypted message that had just illuminated the screen of her private phone. The glare cast a harsh, pale light over her composed features. Attached was a high-resolution still from the bank's mezzanine security feed, her own face, completely unbothered, looking directly into the barrel of the lead gunman's weapon. Beneath the image, a single line of text flashed in stark white, "We know exactly who you are." Her structured, disciplined life, the quiet sanctuary she had painstakingly built from the ashes of her ruined corporate career, was instantly compromised. The walls of her apartment suddenly felt less like a fortress and more like a glass cage. She knew the brutal math of the streets just as intimately as she knew her corporate ledgers. A bruised ego in the underworld demanded blood as compensation. She was a glaring liability to them now, a loose end that had witnessed too much and shown far too little fear. Across the city, in the sprawling, glass-walled penthouse that served as the nerve center of his empire, Seo Kang-Min watched the exact same leaked footage playing on a continuous loop. The glow of the massive monitors caught the sharp, unrelenting angles of his jaw as he leaned forward, a glass of amber liquid forgotten on his mahogany desk. His lieutenants had already traced the digital leak, intercepting the chatter of the cartel members who were currently mobilizing to erase the woman who had embarrassed them. Kang-Min's dark gaze remained fixed on the screen, mesmerized by the glacial, unyielding authority in Kendra's eyes. The dangerous, consuming possessiveness he thought he had buried years ago violently unfurled in his chest. The cartel thought they were hunting a simple cashier. They had no idea they were about to trigger a war with a predator far worse than they could ever imagine. 7 years earlier, the city's underbelly did not forgive mistakes. The night air tasted of ozone and copper, and the rain fell in a relentless sheet that washed the blood into the gutters. Seo Kang-Min, then a fiercely ambitious lieutenant fighting a vicious syndicate war, collapsed against the brick wall of a dead-end alley. A rival faction's ambush had left his crew decimated and a bullet tearing through his side. Pressing a soaked hand to his ribs, his vision fracturing at the edges, he leaned his head back against the damp brick and fully prepared to die in the dark. Then, hands grabbed him. They were not the rough, frantic hands of an assassin finishing the job, but the firm, calculated grip of someone who understood how to manipulate dead weight. A young woman, her face partially shadowed by the collar of a dark coat, hauled him through the rusted service door of a condemned building. She did not scream when the harsh light of the dusty backroom revealed the catastrophic amount of blood soaking his shirt. She didn't ask his name, nor did she ask who was hunting him. Instead, Kendra forced him onto a steel work table, her movements stripped of any panic. She moved with a chilling, mechanical efficiency. Tearing away his ruined shirt, she sterilized a heavy needle and thread from a stolen medical kit. Her hands were remarkably steady. Every stitch she drove into his flesh was precise and devoid of hesitation. Even through the blinding, white-hot haze of his pain, Kang-Min found himself utterly fascinated. She did not look at him with pity or terror. She looked at his lethal wound merely as a structural failure that required immediate, logical repair. When the brutal work was done, she tied off the suture, stepped back, and wiped his blood from her hands using a clean rag. Kang-Min, his breathing ragged but his life securely tethered back to his body, reached into his torn jacket with trembling fingers. He pulled out a thick, crimson-stained roll of $100 bills and held it out to her. It was pure reflex, a transaction. It was the only language his violent world understood, the quickest way to assert dominance and erase a debt. Kendra looked at the bloodied money and then up to his exhausted, hardened face. Her expression remained completely flat, an impenetrable mask of absolute poise. "Keep it," she stated, her voice an uncompromising murmur that easily cut through the drumming rain outside. "If you pay me, this becomes a transaction, and I become an accessory. If I walk out that door with nothing, I was never here." Before he could argue, she turned and dissolved back into the stormy night, leaving the cash untouched on the steel table. She never once looked back. Kang-Min lay in the quiet darkness of the abandoned room, the tight throb of his stitches serving as the first, permanent reminder of the only woman who had ever looked at his wealth, his violence, and his power and refused to bow to any of it. The low, vibrating hum of heavy engines bled through the thin walls of Kendra's third-floor apartment long before the knock came. She didn't flinch. She simply set down her coffee cup on the small, laminate kitchen table and waited. By the time the heavy, synchronized thud of footsteps echoed down her narrow hallway, she had already calculated the variables. She knew the cartel wouldn't announce their arrival with such disciplined precision. This was a different kind of executioner. The knock was singular. A statement, not a request. When Kendra opened the door, the cramped, dimly lit corridor was entirely consumed by the presence of Seo Kang-Min. He stood framed in her doorway, flanked by 3 towering men in immaculate dark suits. He was older now than the bleeding ghost she had stitched together 7 years ago, his features carved from unforgiving stone and hardened by absolute power. His dark eyes scanned the modest, hyper-organized space of her living room before settling heavily onto her face. He was searching for a crack in her composure. He found none. "You have a digital bounty on your head," Kang-Min stated, his voice a low, commanding baritone that left no room for negotiation. He stepped into her apartment without being invited, his sheer size instantly suffocating the room. "The cartel whose operation you dismantled this afternoon has mobilized. You have less than 4 hours before they breach this door and eliminate the liability." Kendra folded her arms, her posture impeccably straight despite the imposing threat standing on her worn rug. "I am aware of the security leak," she replied, her tone glacial. I was preparing my contingencies. Your contingencies are irrelevant, Kang-Min countered smoothly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every word carried the crushing weight of his empire. There is no corporate severance package that protects you from a syndicate hit, Ms. Blake. You cannot outmaneuver a bullet with a spreadsheet. He closed the distance between them, stopping just inches away. The scent of expensive cologne and faint gunpowder rolled off his suit. He looked down at her, the intense, possessive gravity of his gaze attempting to pin her in place. 7 years ago, you refused my money because you refused to be an accessory, he said, the memory adding a dangerous, quiet heat to his words. Tonight, you do not have that luxury. I am not offering you a choice. You are stepping into my syndicate. You will serve as my lead financial administrator, and in exchange, the cartel will find a ghost. Kendra held his stare, her pulse steady despite the overwhelming physical and psychological pressure he exuded. She recognized the power dynamic he was trying to establish, the dominant king claiming a vulnerable asset. And if I refuse your mandate, she asked, her voice dangerously calm. Kang-Min's expression darkened, his jaw clenching as he leaned in, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. Then I will let them burn this building to the ground, and I will pull you from the wreckage anyway. Get your coat. The ride to the syndicate's headquarters was a masterclass in suffocating silence. Kendra sat in the leather-upholstered back of the SUV, her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching the city blur past the tinted glass. She had accepted Kang-Min's mandate, but only after surgically altering the terms. She demanded the immediate eradication of the crushing corporate debt her former mentor, Marcus, had fraudulently pinned on her. It was a calculated transaction, a ledger balanced in exchange for her freedom from the cartel's crosshairs. Kang-Min had agreed, though the dark, predatory amusement in his eyes made it clear he viewed her terms as a temporary illusion of control. They arrived at a sleek, monolithic skyscraper that pierced the city skyline. The private elevator opened into a sprawling penthouse that reeked of opulent brutality. Floors of polished obsidian reflected the muted glow of the city below, and the air was thick with the quiet tension of heavily armed men moving with lethal purpose. This was the nerve center of Kang-Min's empire, a terrifying ecosystem where weakness was immediately consumed. Kang-Min guided her to a massive, glass-walled office, but was briefly pulled away by a whispered update from a subordinate. He left her standing near the mahogany conference table, exposed to the calculating stares of his inner circle. 2 of his deadliest lieutenants detached themselves from the shadows. The larger of the 2, a heavily scarred enforcer named Silas, stepped into Kendra's personal space. He moved with the arrogant swagger of a man accustomed to making outsiders tremble. He looked her up and down, taking in her crisp white shirt and tailored blazer with a dismissive sneer. The boss thinks a corporate teller is going to manage our accounts, Silas murmured, his voice a low, gravelly threat designed to test her nerve. In this room, numbers don't protect you. We deal in blood, sweetheart. If you panic when the ledger gets messy, I'll be the one cleaning you up. Kendra did not take a step back. She slowly leveled her gaze, meeting his hostile stare with glacial indifference. She didn't raise her voice, but her words sliced through the heavy air with absolute precision. I have already reviewed the preliminary expenditures for your enforcement division, Silas, she stated smoothly, her tone as detached as a surgeon reviewing a chart. Your operational costs are bloated, your payroll is inefficient, and your cleanup protocols are financially hemorrhaging this syndicate. I don't panic over messy ledgers. I eradicate the liabilities causing them. She tilted her head slightly, her expression perfectly flat. I suggest you step back before I decide your division is no longer a cost-effective investment. Silas froze, the smugness draining from his scarred face as he recognized the cold, undeniable authority radiating from her. Across the room, Kang-Min watched the exchange. A slow, dark smirk curved the corner of his mouth as his men backed away from the woman who refused to be prey. The boardroom was a theater of calculated brutality, designed to make even the most hardened criminals feel distinctly small. Floor-to-ceiling glass overlooked the sprawling city, but inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. 10 of the syndicate's highest-ranking lieutenants sat around the massive obsidian table, their postures rigid. At the head of the table, Seo Kang-Min radiated an oppressive, lethal energy. He was dissecting a newly proposed money laundering operation through a chain of commercial real estate shell corporations, his deep voice leaving absolutely no room for dissent. He leaned forward, bracing his hands on the polished stone, his dark eyes locking onto Kendra, who sat quietly near his right hand. It was a deliberate test of power. Kang-Min projected his dominance over the entire room, waiting for the newly appointed financial administrator to lower her gaze, to shift uncomfortably, to show that she understood her precarious place in his terrifying world. Kendra did none of those things. She sat with her perfect, upright posture, her tailored black blazer a stark contrast to the heavy leather and tactical gear worn by the men around her. She didn't shrink under his stare. Instead, she methodically tapped her pen against the edge of the printed ledger in front of her, observing him with the same calculating detachment she had shown the bank robbers. "The offshore routing you are suggesting is aggressive," Kang-Min stated, his tone carrying a soft, dangerous edge meant to force submission. "We move the cartel capital through the Cayman accounts by midnight. I expect you to authorize the transfers without delay." The lieutenants held their breath, waiting for the corporate outsider to fold under the pressure. Kendra looked up from the ledger, her expression a mask of absolute, icy composure. She met the Mafia boss's predatory gaze with the calm certainty of a woman who held the winning hand. "I will not authorize those transfers," Kendra replied. Her voice was steady, lacking even a tremor of hesitation. The room went instantly, violently silent. Silas, sitting across from her, froze in his seat. Nobody told Seo Kang-Min no and walked out of the penthouse with a pulse. Kang-Min's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he took a slow, deliberate step toward her chair. "Excuse me. Your strategy is obsolete," she continued smoothly, sliding the ledger across the table toward him. "Pushing that volume of capital through a single Cayman node within a 4-hour window will immediately trigger an automated federal audit under the new banking regulations. You aren't cleaning the money. You are painting a massive digital target on your own back." She didn't use a respectful title. She didn't apologize. She simply laid bare the catastrophic flaw in his empire's architecture. To bypass the algorithms, the funds must be microstructured through the European logistics subsidiaries over a 72-hour period, Kendra instructed, interlacing her fingers on the table. "I have already rewritten the routing protocols. The money will be completely untraceable by Friday." The lieutenants braced for an explosion of violence. Instead, Kang-Min stared down at the corrected ledger and then back at the woman who had just publicly dismantled his authority. A dark, electric thrill flared behind his eyes. He didn't see defiance, he saw sheer, undeniable brilliance. "Execute the European protocols," Kang-Min commanded softly, his gaze never leaving hers. The power dynamic in the room permanently fractured, and Kendra's absolute value was set in stone. The transition from the boardroom victory was swift and suffocating. By the end of her first week, Kendra found her modest apartment quietly vacated, her minimal belongings systematically transferred to a sprawling, high-security penthouse suite directly beneath Kang-Min's own. The space was a masterpiece of modern, cold luxury, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, imported marble, and a massive wardrobe filled with designer business, where perfectly tailored to her measurements. It was an immaculate fortress. It was also a cage. The reality of her gilded imprisonment crystallized on a Tuesday morning. Dressed in a sharp charcoal blazer, Kendra stepped out of her private elevator to head down to the syndicate's financial district. She was immediately flanked by 2 towering enforcers who shadowed her every step. When she reached for the handle of the sleek black town car waiting in the subterranean garage, a heavy hand caught the door first. Seo Kang-Min loomed beside her, the air instantly thickening with his dark, possessive gravity. He held out a matte black credit card with her name embossed in silver. "Your detail will accompany you at all times," he murmured, his voice a low, vibrating hum that demanded absolute compliance. "The card has no limit. If you require anything, they will acquire it for you. You no longer need to navigate this city unprotected, Kendra." He was wrapping her in silk and steel, utilizing his immense wealth to completely insulate her from the outside world. It was a classic dominance tactic, one that would have made anyone else melt into submissive gratitude. Kendra looked at the black card, then up into Kang-Min's intense, predatory eyes. Her expression remained completely unreadable. She did not take the card. "I am your lead financial administrator," she stated, her voice as smooth and unforgiving as cut glass. "I am not a corporate write-off, and I am certainly not a kept asset." His jaw clenched, a dangerous spark igniting in his dark gaze as she defied his direct provision. "You have a cartel actively hunting you. This is protocol." "This is control," she corrected flatly, stepping squarely into his personal space, refusing to be intimidated by his towering height. "My former mentor believed he could purchase my compliance with luxury and isolation. It nearly cost me my freedom. I will not repeat that tactical error. I manage your empire's capital. I do not spend it on myself. If I require security, I will requisition it from the payroll I oversee. But I dictate my own movements." She reached out, gently but firmly pushing his hand and the black card away. "I earned my place at your boardroom table," she said, her eyes locking onto his with unshakable conviction. "Do not insult my value by treating me like a possession." For a long, electric moment, the underground garage was dead silent. Kang-Min stared down at the fiercely independent woman, defying his every instinct to dominate and protect. Slowly, the dangerous tension in his shoulders eased. He lowered the card, a dark, reverent smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth as he realized he could never cage her. He stepped back, opening the car door for her himself. The city below was a sprawling grid of amber lights, but inside the penthouse office, the only illumination came from the stark glow of Kendra's dual monitors. It was past 2 in the morning. The syndicate's enforcers had long since retreated to the lower levels, leaving the glass-walled sanctum cloaked in heavy, insulated silence. Kendra sat perfectly upright at the sprawling mahogany table, her tailored black blazer draped over the back of her chair, the sleeves of her crisp white shirt rolled precisely to the elbows. She was systematically dismantling a labyrinth of corrupt shell corporations, her keystrokes forming a rapid, methodical rhythm in the quiet room. She was not alone. Seo Kang-Min sat in the shadows across the office, a glass of untouched bourbon resting on the arm of his leather chair. He had been watching her for nearly 2 hours. He was a man accustomed to absolute, terrifying control, intimately used to people folding under the mere weight of his gaze. Yet, Kendra operated as if the most dangerous man in the city were nothing more than a piece of background scenery. "Your European logistics accounts are hemorrhaging capital through phantom transit fees," Kendra stated into the quiet, not once looking away from her screen. Her voice was a calm, cool murmur. Kang-Min shifted, the expensive leather of his chair creaking. "A necessary operational loss to maintain the shipping lanes." "A lazy administrative oversight," she corrected flatly, her eyes tracking a dense column of numbers. "I have already rerouted the transit lines through your legitimate textile subsidiaries. You will recover $4 million by the end of the quarter, and the federal algorithms won't have a single breadcrumb to follow." Kang-Min stood. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of an apex predator, crossing the dark room until he stopped directly behind her chair. He leaned forward, placing a heavy, scarred hand flat on the desk beside her keyboard. His sheer physical proximity was an overwhelming wave of heat, expensive cologne, and dark authority. He was close enough that she could feel the deep, vibrating rumble of his chest. "You don't sleep, Miss Blake," he murmured, his voice dropping an octave, the sound brushing intimately against the shell of her ear. Kendra didn't flinch. Her hands never broke their rhythm over the keys. "I sleep when the ledger is balanced. Unmonitored chaos is expensive." "And what do you consider this?" he asked softly, his dark gaze dropping from the monitors to trace the elegant, tense line of her neck. He wasn't talking about the financial accounts. The air between them thickened, heavy with an electric, smoldering gravity that had absolutely nothing to do with money. It was a silent, intense battle of wills, his dominant, possessive instinct pressing heavily against her ironclad refusal to bend. Kendra finally paused her typing. Slowly, she turned her head, meeting his dark, consuming stare with perfect, glacial composure. She was entirely surrounded by his massive frame, trapped in the cage of his arms leaning on the desk, yet she held all the actual power in the room. "I consider this an audit," she replied evenly, her breath ghosting over his jawline. "And your margins are steadily improving." A slow, dangerous smile curved Kang-Min's lips. He didn't pull away. He simply stayed there in the dark, completely captivated by the only woman who could look a monster in the eyes and calmly correct his math. The discrepancy was microscopic, a fraction of a percent siphoned from overseas logistics. To anyone else, it was a rounding error. To Kendra Blake, it was a glaring beacon of betrayal. She did not immediately take the ledger to Seo Kang-Min. That was what an employee would do, seeking a superior's intervention. Kendra was an architect of capital, and an architect does not ask for permission to reinforce a crumbling wall. By 8 a.m. on a Thursday, she had traced the phantom numbers through a labyrinth of dummy corporations straight to the private accounts of Elias, one of Kang-Min's trusted supply chain lieutenants. Elias had been quietly stealing from the king. Kendra didn't summon security. She summoned Elias to the glass-walled boardroom. When the lieutenant swaggered in, expecting a routine financial review, he found Kendra sitting perfectly still at the head of the obsidian table. Kang-Min stood silently in the corner shadows, his arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with dark, predatory curiosity. He had allowed Kendra to call the meeting, waiting to see how his new asset would handle syndicate discipline. "Sit," Kendra instructed. Her voice was flat, entirely devoid of anger. It was the terrifying calm of a judge who had already signed the execution order. Elias smirked, glancing at his boss before sinking into a leather chair. "Listen, corporate. If this is about the port fees. At 4 a.m., I initiated a hard freeze on your personal offshore accounts in Geneva, the Caymans, and Belize," Kendra interrupted, her tone smooth and absolute. She slid a sleek tablet across the table. "I have also reclaimed the $2.4 million you siphoned from the logistics division, applying it back to the syndicate's primary holdings with compounded interest. You currently possess 0 liquid assets. Your mortgages are in default as of an hour ago." The blood drained from Elias's face. He lunged forward, his hands slamming onto the table. "You arrogant, you can't do that." "Boss, she can't." Kang-Min didn't move. His dark eyes were fixed entirely on Kendra, a dangerous, intoxicating thrill igniting in his chest. "I already have," Kendra stated, not a single muscle in her posture shifting as the enraged man loomed over her. "Furthermore, the digital trail of your embezzlement has been packaged and anonymously forwarded to the rival cartel you intended to defect to. They now know you are broke and compromised. You are a liability to them and a finalized ledger to me." She tapped her pen once against the table. "You are dismissed." Elias stood frozen, realizing he hadn't just been fired. He had been surgically, bloodlessly eradicated. He stumbled out of the room, a dead man walking. In the heavy silence that followed, Kang-Min slowly stepped out of the shadows. He looked at the crisp, unbothered woman sitting at his table. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't drawn a weapon. Yet, she had just destroyed one of his most dangerous men with a spreadsheet. Kang-Min finally understood the terrifying truth. He hadn't hired an administrator. He had gained a formidable strategist. Marcus Vance poured himself a measure of scotch, the heavy crystal clinking against the glass, in the quiet of his corner office. On his monitor, the leaked security footage from the Metropolitan Bank played on a continuous loop. He paused the video on the high-resolution frame of the cashier's face. Kendra Blake. For 2 years, Marcus had assumed she was utterly destroyed. He had painstakingly mentored her, molded her brilliance to serve his own corporate ambitions, and when his massive financial fraud threatened to unravel his life, he had surgically pinned the entire catastrophic debt on her. He had stripped her of her credentials, her reputation, and her voice, isolating her and leaving her to drown in the ruins of a shattered career. He had expected her to break. He had wanted her to stay small, terrified, and compliant. Instead, here she was. Not crying. Not begging. Standing behind a bank counter with the exact same glacial, calculating stare that used to manage his billion-dollar portfolios. But Marcus hadn't just found the bank footage. His algorithms had tracked the subsequent financial ripples. The sudden, brutal eradication of the multi-million-dollar debt he had anchored to her name hadn't been a clerical error. The capital required to wipe that slate clean belonged to Seo Kang-Min's syndicate. Kendra hadn't just survived the heist, she had aligned herself with the apex predator of the city's underworld. A cold, ugly knot of possessive rage tightened in Marcus's chest. She was his creation. Her intellect, her ironclad discipline, he believed he had forged it. The thought of her utilizing her terrifying brilliance for another man, especially a mafia boss who could easily fund her revenge, was an intolerable threat. If Kendra had the syndicate's resources, it was only a matter of time before she systematically dismantled Marcus's life. He needed to eradicate her before she realized the full extent of her new power. Marcus opened a secure, encrypted channel on his terminal. He was a creature of corporate warfare, accustomed to destroying lives with spreadsheets and non-disclosure agreements, but Kendra's new reality required a much blunter instrument. He reviewed the digital dossier he had compiled on the cartel crew humiliated in the bank heist. They were reckless, heavily armed, and currently scouring the city for the woman who had embarrassed them. They had the firepower and the bloodlust. Marcus had the tactical intelligence and the backdoor access to the city's financial grids. He typed a brief, untraceable message to the cartel's proxy, attaching the exact GPS coordinates of the secure server nodes Kendra was currently using to route Kang-Min's capital. "I know who the cashier works for," Marcus typed, the glow of the monitor illuminating his cruel, satisfied smile. "And I know exactly how to draw her out." The ghosts of Kendra's past were no longer confined to her nightmares. They were armed, allied, and coming for her sanctuary. The penthouse was a fortress of glass, steel, and silence. At 1 a.m., Kendra sat in the center of her digital domain, the glow of 6 monitors illuminating the sharp, controlled lines of her face. She was running a routine encryption sweep on the syndicate's Cayman nodes. She felt entirely secure. Kang-Min's empire had provided an impenetrable wall between her and the world that had tried to crush her. Then, the primary monitor flickered. It wasn't a power surge. The syndicate servers were insulated against physical grid failures. Kendra's fingers flew across the keyboard, executing a hard manual override, but the keystrokes registered as dead input. A cold, creeping sensation began to spread through her chest. One by one, the surrounding screens went entirely black, plunging the room into darkness save for a single, stark white cursor blinking in the center of her main terminal. The firewall hadn't just been breached, it had been bypassed using an obsolete corporate backdoor architecture she hadn't seen in 2 years. She knew immediately who had built it. Text began to crawl across the black screen, each character dropping into place with the rhythmic, agonizing precision of a ticking clock. "You wear his suits. You spend his money. You think hiding behind a monster makes you untouchable." Kendra stopped breathing. The air in the room suddenly felt impossibly thin. "But I know exactly how small you really are, Kendra. I built you. I broke you. And I can take you apart again." Attached beneath the text was a live GPS feed. It wasn't tracking her. It was tracking the encrypted transport route of Kang-Min's logistics crew, the exact route she had personally redesigned and authorized just hours ago. Red warning markers began flashing across the map, pinpointing the locations where cartel intercept teams were already moving into position. Marcus hadn't just found her. He had weaponized her own flawless logistics against her new sanctuary. He had partnered with the cartel to orchestrate a massacre, and he was making sure she watched the board collapse. For the first time since the bank heist, Kendra's absolute control fractured. The woman who had stared down a loaded gun without blinking stared at the glowing screen, and a violent, involuntary tremor seized her left hand. Her pulse hammered frantically against her ribs, a deafening drumbeat of pure, resurrected trauma. She was suddenly 24 again, sitting in Marcus's office, being systematically stripped of her voice, her autonomy, her entire identity. The walls of Kang-Min's impenetrable penthouse felt as though they were closing in, the luxury shrinking to crush her. She pressed her palms flat against the mahogany desk, her knuckles turning bone white as she fought a desperate, silent war against the panic rising in her throat, paralyzed in the dark by the ghost she thought she had buried. The air in the study dropped 10 degrees the moment Kang-Min's gaze locked onto her trembling hands. The tear on her sleeve and the faint, bruised print of a hand on her wrist were all the testimony he needed. A terrifying, absolute silence descended upon him, the unnatural calm of a predator the exact second before it strikes. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't offer soft words of comfort. Instead, he reached for the encrypted radio on his heavy mahogany desk. His voice, when he finally spoke, was stripped of all humanity, reduced to cold, lethal command. Seal the perimeter. Bring me the men who touched her. No one dies until I say so. The syndicate boss had fully awakened, his dominant instinct entirely consumed by the primal need to obliterate the threat to what was his. The sheer power radiating from him was a physical weight in the room, suffocating and dark. He moved toward the door, slipping a custom-forged blade from his shoulder holster, his jaw set in a rigid line of pure, unadulterated violence. He was going to slaughter them slowly, intending to paint the compound in their blood to soothe his own feral rage. But as his hand closed over the brass doorknob, a smaller, defiantly steady hand slammed against the heavy oak wood, blocking his exit. Kang-Min looked down, his obsidian eyes flashing with a dark warning that routinely made hardened killers drop to their knees in terror. But Kendra stood her ground. Her chest heaved, her pulse racing wildly against the delicate skin of her throat, but her chin was tipped up in fierce, undeniable challenge. Move, Kendra, he warned, a low, guttural growl vibrating deep in his chest. No, she snapped back, her voice entirely stripped of the tremor that had plagued her only moments ago. You don't get to do this. They laid hands on you. They breathed borrowed air. And they will pay for it, Kendra said, stepping a fraction closer, refusing to shrink from his towering, imposing frame. But I am not some fragile piece of porcelain you keep locked in a display case. I am not a possession you polish and protect while I cower in the shadows. Kang-Min's lethal expression faltered, a microscopic crack forming in his terrifying facade. He was accustomed to total obedience, to a world that worshipped his power and feared his wrath. He was not accustomed to the woman he burned for stepping into the line of fire to demand she fight her own wars. You think I'm weak, she challenged, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper as she pressed her palm flat against his chest, right over his racing heart. If I am going to survive in your world, Kang-Min, I have to be the one holding the knife. Stop trying to fight my battles for me. Let me stand beside you. The violent bloodlust in his eyes warred with something entirely new, a profound, devastating reverence. The power dynamic shifted, tectonic plates realigning beneath their feet as he stared at the woman demanding to be his equal, not his victim. The silence in the office was absolute, thick enough to choke on. Kang-Min stared at the woman pinning him in place with nothing but a palm against his chest and eyes ablaze with defiance. The blade in his hand felt heavy, redundant. Every instinct forged in the brutal underworld screamed at him to push her aside, to lock her away in a gilded cage where the filth of his empire could never reach her. Autonomy, he tested the word, a low rumble that vibrated through the silk of his shirt against her hand. It tasted foreign on his tongue. In his world, there were predators and prey, masters and subordinates. To grant autonomy was to surrender control. Total autonomy, Kendra corrected, not yielding a single inch. Her fingers curled into his shirt, anchoring herself to the epicenter of his volatile storm. I won't be your shadow, Kang-Min. I won't be a liability you have to constantly shield. If you want me here, in this life with you, you have to let me bleed for it. You have to let me fight. He stepped into her space, crowding her, testing the absolute limits of her resolve. The heat radiating between them was electric. The men who operate in my circles do not play by rules, Kendra. They will not respect your defiance. They will only see leverage to use against me. Then teach me how to make them see a threat, she countered, her voice dropping to a fierce, steady register. Don't hide me from the monsters. Teach me how to break them. The raw, unfiltered strength in her words struck a chord deep within his chest, fracturing the ironclad walls of his control. He realized, with a jarring clarity, that the suffocating grip he called protection was slowly extinguishing the very fire that drew him to her in the first place. He had spent his life viewing innocence as something delicate to be hoarded and possessed. But the woman standing before him wasn't glass waiting to be shattered. She was steel demanding to be forged. Kang-Min slowly lifted his free hand, the pads of his fingers lightly tracing the soft, unblemished skin of her jaw. The jarring contrast between his capacity for lethal violence and this devastatingly tender touch made the breath catch in her throat. "If I let you step out of the shadows," he murmured, his dark gaze dropping to her lips before rising back to meet her unwavering stare, "there is no going back. The blood won't wash off. The nightmares won't fade. I'm already standing in the dark with you," she whispered, leaning into his touch without breaking eye contact. "Now hand me a match." With a slow, heavy exhale, Kang-Min slid the custom blade back into his shoulder holster, yielding to the shift in their universe. The heavy oak door of the study remained closed, the air inside still charged with the electric aftermath of their confrontation. Kang-Min looked at the encrypted radio resting on his desk, the instrument of his absolute authority. For over a decade, his reign had been defined by swift, merciless retribution. To hesitate was to show weakness. To stay his hand was an anomaly his ruthless world would never understand. Yet, looking at Kendra, standing tall and unbroken, the foundation of his empire felt utterly insignificant compared to the fire in her eyes. He picked up the receiver. The thick silence stretched, a palpable tension tightening his jaw before he finally pressed the comms button. "Stand down." The two words were spoken softly, but they echoed like a gunshot through the room. Static crackled from the speaker before his second-in-command's hesitant voice filtered through. "Boss? The perimeter is secured. We have them cornered." Awaiting the order to execute. Kang-Min's obsidian eyes never left Kendra's. The possessive beast inside him clawed at his chest, screaming for the blood of the men who had dared to touch her. It was a physical agony to cage that beast, a profound moral shift that demanded every ounce of his legendary iron will. But he was no longer just a king guarding a fragile treasure. He was a man surrendering his absolute control to watch her rise. "I said stand down," Kang-Min repeated, his tone leaving no room for debate. "Pull the executioners back. Secure the prisoners in the holding wing and wait for her instructions." He cut the channel, the sudden silence sealing the momentous shift in the room. Moving deliberately, he bypassed his desk and walked over to the massive, steel-reinforced safe built into the wall. He spun the dial, the heavy metallic clicks acting as a countdown. Pulling the heavy door open, he extracted a sleek, black encrypted tablet, the central nervous system of his entire syndicate, containing access codes, blackmail files, and direct lines to his most lethal operatives. He walked back to her, the distance feeling like a bridge between his violent past and the dangerous, intoxicating future they were forging together. Slowly, reverently, he placed the tablet into her hands. "My men, my resources, my network," he murmured, his voice a gravelly caress that sent a shiver down her spine. "They are yours, Kendra. You wanted to hold the knife. You wanted to break the monsters. So do it. You lead the counterattack, and I will ensure the entire city bows to your command." It was the ultimate act of devotion, a terrifying and beautiful transfer of power from the city's most dangerous predator to the woman who commanded his very soul. As her fingers closed around the cold metal of the device, the final remnants of the fragile captive dissolved, replaced by the lethal equal he had just unleashed upon the underworld. The cold weight of the encrypted tablet in Kendra's hands was a physical reminder of the empire she now wielded. She sat in the leather chair behind Kang-Min's massive desk, a throne she had claimed not by force, but by a chillingly calm demand for equality. Kang-Min leaned against the heavy oak door, his arms crossed over his chest, enveloped in the shadows. He was a silent, lethal spectator watching his queen survey the board. She didn't hesitate. Pulling up the syndicate's secure communications network, her fingers flew across the screen, bypassing firewalls to establish an untraceable connection to the cartel's inner circle. The dial tone echoed in the cavernous office, each ring a tightening coil of anticipation. When the line finally clicked open, she didn't wait for a greeting. "Marcus," she breathed. She pitched her voice perfectly. Gone was the steel that had just commanded the city's most feared predator. In its place was a trembling, desperate whisper, the exact sound of a terrified captive reaching the end of her endurance. Well, Marcus's voice slithered through the speaker, thick with cruel amusement. The untouchable pet. How did you get this frequency? He left his tablet unlocked, Kendra stammered, injecting a perfectly timed hitch into her breath. She met Kang-Min's gaze across the room. A dark, devastating smirk pulled at the corner of the boss's mouth as he realized the brilliance of her deception. Marcus, please. You were right. He's a monster. I can't survive him. Silence stretched over the line, heavy with the cartel leader's calculation. And what do you want me to do about it, little bird? Kang-Min would burn the city to ash if I took you. I can give you his supply routes, she offered, leaning closer to the microphone, letting the desperation bleed into her tone. I can give you the security rotation for the southern docks. Just get me out of here before he kills me. The bait was irresistible. The prospect of crushing Kang-Min's empire from the inside, delivered by the very woman he guarded so fiercely, was a narcotic Marcus could never refuse. Midnight, Marcus finally agreed, his voice dropping to a greedy purr. The abandoned rail yard on the edge of the district. Come alone and bring the data. If this is a trick, I'll let my men have their fun before we send you back to him in pieces. I'll be there, she whispered, and severed the connection. Kendra set the tablet down, the fragile facade dissolving instantly into cold, hard calculation. She looked up at Kang-Min. His eyes were burning with a dark, consuming pride that set her blood on fire. The trap was set. Now it was time to show the monsters what happened when the bait had teeth. The midnight air inside the abandoned rail yard warehouse was thick with the suffocating scent of rust and decaying concrete. Kendra stood alone in the center of the cavernous expanse, a solitary figure illuminated by the pale moonlight filtering through shattered skylights. Her heart drummed a steady, controlled rhythm against her ribs. She clutched a sleek silver briefcase to her chest, pulling her coat tight, playing the part of the desperate defector to absolute perfection. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed from the gloom. Suddenly, industrial floodlights violently snapped on, momentarily blinding her before her vision adjusted to the harsh, unforgiving glare. Marcus stepped out from behind a decaying steel pillar, flanked by a dozen heavily armed cartel enforcers. His smile was a venomous slash across his face, his eyes gleaming with the predatory triumph of a man who firmly believed he had just checkmated a king. I have to admit, Marcus sneered, his voice amplifying in the hollow space as he slowly closed the distance. I didn't think you actually had the nerve to show up, little bird. I thought for sure Kang-Min's prized possession would be too terrified to fly the coop. Kendra shrank back a fraction of an inch, a masterfully calculated flinch that sent a visible thrill of sadistic pleasure through the cartel boss. I brought the supply routes, she said, her voice trembling just enough to sell the fragile illusion. The security rotations, the offshore accounts. Everything you asked for. Now let me walk away. Marcus laughed, a harsh, grating sound that bounced off the corrugated steel roof. He gestured lazily to his men, who tightened the circle around her, the ominous clatter of assault. Rifles clicking off their safeties filling the silence. The sheer power imbalance should have crushed her, a lone woman surrounded by the Underworld's most ruthless killers. But Kendra felt no terror, only the cold, intoxicating rush of stepping fully into her own newly minted power. Walk away, Marcus mocked, stopping mere inches from her face. He reached out, his rough fingers bruising her chin as he forced her to look up at him. You really are a naive little thing. Kang-Min kept you locked away because you're weak. You thought you could betray him, hand me his crown, and just disappear? I'm going to gut his empire, and then I'm going to send you back to him in a box. It's the perfect ending. Kendra didn't pull away from his grip. Instead, the terrified tremor in her breath vanished entirely. Her posture straightened, the illusion of the broken captive melting away to reveal the lethal, unyielding queen forged in Kang-Min's dark fire. She looked directly into Marcus's eyes, her gaze suddenly dropping the temperature in the room to sub-zero. You're right about one thing, Marcus, she whispered, a chilling, triumphant smile curving her lips as she caught the faint, synchronized scrape of tactical boots on the catwalks above them. It is a perfect ending. Just not for me. Marcus's cruel smile faltered, a flicker of genuine confusion breaking through his arrogant facade as Kendra's icy words echoed in the damp air. He released her chin, taking a half step back, as if suddenly realizing he had been holding a live grenade rather than a fragile bird. Before he could bark an order to his heavily armed enforcers, Kendra smoothly popped the latches on the silver briefcase she had been clutching. She didn't produce stacks of printed supply routes or stolen hard drives. Instead, she turned a single, sleek tablet toward him, the very same device Kang-Min had entrusted to her. The screen glowed with a cascade of scrolling red digits and processing bars. "You thought I came here to trade Kang-Min's empire for my life," she said, her voice dropping into a deadly, velvet calm. She took a deliberate step forward, forcing the cartel boss to hold his ground. "But you underestimated what happens when you corner someone who has finally stopped fearing the dark. I didn't access his network to betray him, Marcus. I used his network to dismantle yours." Marcus scoffed, though a bead of cold sweat materialized at his temple. "You're bluffing. You don't have the clearance. The offshore accounts in the Caymans, the shell corporations in Zurich, the ghost funds you used to pay off the harbor masters," Kendra interrupted, listing them with a devastating, surgical precision. "As of 3 minutes ago, every single cent has been frozen, drained, and permanently redirected into syndicates you will never touch again. You are entirely bankrupt." A restless murmur rippled through the ring of enforcers. Loyalty in the underworld was strictly bought and paid for. Without money, Marcus was nothing but a dead man standing. "You lying bitch," he hissed, lunging forward. But the distinctive, deafening metallic clack of dozens of assault rifles racking simultaneously from the shadows above froze him in his tracks. "I'm not finished," Kendra whispered, her eyes burning with a ruthless, newly forged authority. "While your tech guys were busy tracing the dummy signal I fed them to set up this meeting, I forwarded the GPS coordinates of your processing plants, your hidden armories, and your top lieutenant's safe houses directly to the federal task force. Sirens are already ringing across the city." She watched the color completely drain from his face as the absolute realization of his ruin crashed down upon him. He had sought to exploit her perceived weakness, only to be entirely annihilated by her meteoric rise in power. She was no longer the collateral damage of a mafia war. She was the merciless architect of his destruction. Closing the briefcase with a sharp, final snap, she looked at the broken man before her. "Kang-Min didn't send me here as a sacrifice. He sent me as his executioner." The echo of the snapping briefcase was the loudest sound in the cavernous rail yard, ringing with the absolute finality of a judge's gavel. Marcus stared at Kendra, the arrogant sneer that had defined his features melting into slack-jawed horror. He looked past her, his frantic gaze darting toward the rusted catwalks where the faint, ruby-red laser sights of Kang-Min's elite snipers painted a dozen lethal targets squarely on the chests of his men. Panic, raw and unfiltered, finally bled into Marcus's eyes. He turned to his heavily armed enforcers, expecting them to raise their weapons, to fight back, to defend the bloody cartel he had built from nothing. But loyalty in their ruthless world was a strictly financial commodity, and Kendra had just zeroed out his accounts. Slowly, deliberately, his enforcers lowered their rifles, taking a collective step away from their former boss. They weren't going to bleed for a man who could no longer pay them. "Look at them, Marcus," Kendra said, her voice a soft, razor-sharp purr that sliced through the agonizing silence. She stepped closer, invading his space just as he had violently invaded hers only moments before, but this time, the power dynamic was entirely inverted. "Look at the men who swore to die for you. They see exactly what I see. A dead man who doesn't even have the liquid assets to buy his own coffin. You." Marcus choked out, his throat working convulsively as the sheer, suffocating magnitude of his defeat paralyzed him. "Kang-Min. He'll never let you wield this kind of—" "Kang-Min gave me the keys," she interrupted, her tone bleeding with an icy, unshakable authority. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. True power didn't have to shout to be heard. "You thought you could leverage me because you firmly believed I was nothing but a pawn. A fragile little possession to be bartered in the dark. But you failed to realize that the king doesn't rule the board, Marcus. The queen does." She circled him slowly, a predator casually inspecting its prey, letting him feel the crushing weight of his total evisceration. Every measured step she took dismantled another piece of his toxic pride. She hadn't fired a single shot, hadn't shed a single drop of blood, yet she had systematically stripped him of his wealth, his army, and his untouchable reputation. He was entirely hollowed out, left with nothing but the terrifying realization that he had been flawlessly outplayed by the very woman he had sought to break. The federal task force will breach those doors in exactly 3 minutes, Kendra stated, stopping in front of him one last time. Her eyes were devoid of mercy, perfectly reflecting the dark, unforgiving world she had just claimed as her own. They will find you abandoned, utterly bankrupt, and holding the digital footprint of every atrocity your cartel has committed over the last decade. You're going to spend the rest of your miserable life rotting in a concrete box, knowing that Kang-Min's pet put you there. She turned her back on him, the ultimate, profound display of total dismissal, and began walking toward the shadows where her king waited. As Kendra's heels clicked against the cracked concrete, the heavy, suffocating shadows at the edge of the warehouse began to shift. The darkness seemed to part, yielding to the towering, immaculate figure of Kang-Min. He stepped into the pale moonlight, the custom tailoring of his dark suit a stark contrast to the decay around them. Behind him, dozens of his most elite enforcers materialized, stepping out from the rusted catwalks and blind spots, their weapons lowered, but their lethal intent vibrating in the cold air. Marcus let out a strangled, pathetic sound. He had expected Kang-Min to burst in with guns blazing, driven by the feral, possessive rage that had always defined the syndicate boss. He had braced himself for violence, anticipating a brutal, bloody execution. Instead, Kang-Min barely spared the ruined cartel leader a glance. His obsidian eyes were locked entirely on Kendra. The terrifying, ruthless predator who had ruled the city's underworld with an iron fist was perfectly still, anchored by a man utterly consumed by a dark, devastating reverence. The suffocating dominance that had once threatened to break her had fully transmuted into absolute, unwavering devotion. Kang-Min, Marcus wheezed, his knees finally buckling as the remaining shreds of his bravado dissolved into the dust. Just kill me. Don't let them put me in a cage. Kang-Min slowly dragged his gaze from his queen to the broken man sobbing on the floor. His expression was a mask of cold, indifferent stone. You don't belong to me, Marcus, he stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that offered no mercy. She has already decided your fate. I do not question her judgment. The words struck with the force of a physical blow, echoing through the silent ranks of enforcers. The most dangerous man in the city was publicly, unequivocally deferring to her authority. It was the ultimate surrender, a monumental shift that completely rewrote the laws of their brutal world. He wasn't just letting her hold the knife, he was letting her dictate who bled and who was left to rot. Kang-Min reached out as Kendra closed the final distance between them, his large, scarred hands gently framing her face. The terrifying contrast between the monster he was to the world and the man he was for her sent a dizzying rush of heat through her veins. He didn't kiss her, not yet. He simply rested his forehead against hers, breathing her in as the distant, high-pitched wail of federal sirens began to pierce the night. Flawless, he murmured, his voice thick with a dark, consuming pride. He slid his hand down to lace his fingers through hers, securing their grip, equals in the dark, forged in the very fire that had sought to destroy them. Without another word, they turned and walked back into the shadows, leaving Marcus kneeling in the ruins of his own making. The heavy, armored doors of the compound sealed shut behind them, cutting off the distant wail of sirens and the chaos they had flawlessly orchestrated. Inside the quiet sanctuary of Kang-Min's private penthouse, the adrenaline that had fueled Kendra's blood began to ebb, leaving behind a profound, vibrating stillness. The air between them was different now, thrumming with a dangerous, electric equality. She was no longer a captive surviving in a predator's den. She was the merciless architect of his enemy's ruin. Kang-Min shrugged off his suit jacket, tossing it carelessly over a leather armchair. He didn't pour a drink. He didn't move to his desk to check the secure comms. Instead, he walked slowly toward where Kendra stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the sprawling, glittering city they had just irrevocably claimed together. The moonlight caught the sharp, brutal angles of his face, highlighting the profound moral shift that had entirely rewired the city's most ruthless king. He stopped just inches from her, his obsidian eyes burning with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. For a long, suffocating moment, he simply looked at her, his gaze tracing the defiant tilt of her chin and the steady rhythm of her pulse, drinking in the magnificent, lethal woman forged in the crucible of his dark world. Then, the man who commanded an army of killers, who had never bowed to a single living soul, smoothly and deliberately lowered himself to one knee. Kendra gasped, her hands instinctively reaching out, but she froze as he caught her right hand in both of his. This wasn't a proposal woven from fragile, civilian romance. There was no velvet box, no diamond ring to signify ownership or protection. The gesture carried the heavy, blood-soaked weight of the underworld, an absolute, soul-deep surrender of his legendary dominance. Kang-Min, she breathed, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs as she stared down at the terrifying syndicate boss kneeling at her feet. "I spent my life building a fortress," he murmured, his deep, gravelly voice echoing in the quiet room. "I believed power was total control. I believed I had to hoard you in the shadows to keep you safe." He turned her hand over, pressing a burning, reverent kiss to her inner wrist, right over her racing pulse. "But you didn't need a shield, Kendra. You needed a sword." He looked up, his dark eyes fiercely locking onto hers. The possessive beast inside him had been entirely mastered, replaced by an unshakable, devastating devotion. "This empire is yours," he swore, the vow sealing her meteoric rise from pawn to queen. "My men, my wealth, my blood. I don't want a possession to protect. I want a partner to rule. Command me, Kendra, and I will burn the world to light your way." She laced her fingers through his, pulling him up from the floor to stand exactly where he belonged, right by her side. The air in the subterranean boardroom was thick with the smoke of imported cigars and the suffocating tension of 30 hardened syndicate bosses. The long, obsidian table was the epicenter of the city's criminal underworld, a place where weakness was historically punished with a bullet. At the head of the table sat Kang-Min, cloaked in the terrifying, lethal stillness that had kept these predators in line for a decade. But tonight, the true source of the room's unease wasn't the king. It was the queen seated to his immediate right. Kendra didn't shrink beneath the heavy, calculating stares of the men who had once dismissed her as collateral damage. She wore a tailored crimson suit that mirrored the blood they dealt in, her posture impeccably straight, her gaze cool and unbothered. She was no longer a secret kept in the shadows of Kang-Min's penthouse. She was the architect of Marcus's total annihilation, a ghost story whispered in the darkest corners of the city, and she was here to command her empire. This restructuring of the supply lines, growled Rossi, an old guard capo whose face was mapped with knife scars. He directed his grievance entirely at Kang-Min, intentionally ignoring the woman beside him. "It cuts our margins by 12%. We bleed for this territory. We don't take pay cuts." A dangerous, feral silence instantly descended upon the room. Kang-Min's jaw clenched, his hand sliding toward the cold steel resting on his thigh. For years, insubordination like Rossi's would have resulted in an immediate, violent execution. But before Kang-Min could unleash the monster, Kendra's voice sliced through the tension, a smooth, razor-sharp calm that commanded absolute attention. "Your margins are cut, Rossi, because your laundering operations are archaic and hemorrhaging capital," she stated, smoothly sliding a sleek, black folder across the polished glass. "You've been losing 20% to federal seizures at the ports. My new routing protocols bypass maritime customs entirely, utilizing encrypted, automated ghost freight. You aren't taking a pay cut. I am saving you from your own incompetence, netting you an 8% increase in liquid profit by the third quarter." Rossi opened the folder, the color draining from his scarred face as he read the flawless, undeniable proof of her strategic brilliance. The room held its collective breath. They looked to Kang-Min, waiting for the possessive, dominant boss to silence the woman speaking out of turn. Instead, Kang-Min leaned back in his leather chair, a dark, devastating smirk curving his lips. He didn't just tolerate her authority, he worshipped it. He looked at the men around the table, his eyes burning with a lethal promise. "The era of blunt force is over," Kang-Min rumbled, his voice wrapping around the room like a velvet garrote. He reached out, casually resting his scarred hand over Kendra's in a public, unbreakable display of unity. My queen has rewritten the board. You will follow her strategies, or you will become a casualty of them. The choice is yours. As the capos slowly, inevitably bowed their heads in submission, Kendra met Kang-Min's gaze. In the reflection of his obsidian eyes, she saw the complete realization of her rise, a woman who had perfectly matched a monster's dark power with absolute, brilliant control. The sprawling, neon-lit skyline of the city reflected in the reinforced glass of the penthouse, painting the dark room in violent hues of crimson and gold. Kang-Min stood in the quiet shadows, a glass of amber liquid forgotten in his hand, watching Kendra sleep. The rhythmic rise and fall of her breathing was the only sound in the cavernous space, a steady heartbeat that anchored his volatile soul. For a decade, he had measured his power in the currency of fear. True strength, he had once believed, was absolute, unyielding submission. It was the ability to break a spirit, to cage a beautiful thing and call it protection. When she had first been dropped into his brutal world, his dominant instincts had screamed at him to hoard her, to suffocate her fire under the guise of keeping her safe from the monsters that roamed his territory. He had almost been the worst monster of them all, a king slowly extinguishing the very light he claimed to worship. But as he traced the fierce, unyielding lines of her face in the dim light, the profound magnitude of his own moral shift settled deep into his bones. The true measure of power was not found in forcing someone to their knees. It was found in the terrifying, beautiful surrender of handing them the blade. He had watched her rise from a desperate captive to the lethal architect of his empire's future. By relinquishing his suffocating grip, he hadn't lost his dominion, he had doubled it. She had met his dark, violent power with a brilliant, calculating control that humbled the most hardened killers in the syndicate. The devotion that now burned in his chest was no longer toxic, it was empowering. It was a worship built on the unshakable foundation of absolute equality. Kendra stirred, the heavy silk sheets slipping from her shoulder as her eyes fluttered open. She found him instantly in the dark, her gaze clear and entirely devoid of the terror that had once defined their dynamic. She didn't see a captor standing over her. She saw the man who had willingly laid his entire kingdom at her feet. Thinking about the board, she murmured, her voice husky with sleep, yet vibrating with the quiet authority she now wielded flawlessly. Kang-Min set his glass down and moved toward the bed, the lethal predator tamed entirely by his queen. He climbed in beside her, pulling her against his chest, feeling the steady thrum of her pulse, not in panic, but in perfect, powerful synchronization with his own. "No," he whispered, pressing a deeply reverent kiss to her temple. "I was just thinking about the woman who conquered it."